My focus this morning is not going to be so much generic landscaping, but centered around landscaping for environmental policy-driven markets. It's a niche. It's a fairly new niche. It's not for everyone. You do need to do your homework, and there's a lot of issues in this market that you need to consider. You should do a feasibility study to figure out what that market's like, sort of get an idea of whether you really want to get into it and all the intricacies of it. You need to determine who those customers are and what they want. This market is increasingly developing, and we don't need to let somebody else make the decisions for it. We need to be the ones giving input. Part of that's going to be a matter of understanding what is meant by native. Some of those folks driving that market don't understand that term. They think of natives as being anything that they've seen out in the woods without really knowing whether or not indeed it was found there in nature or it was planted there by some bird from an outside source. Sometimes they will include plants that are not indigenous just because they'd somehow got this perception that it was indeed native, and we end up with plants in the environment that turn out to become invasive because of this miscommunication or misconception of whether the plant is native or not. Why do we need to look at that market? Most of those environmental policies require native vegetation, and they're requiring that for improving water quality, and they're concerned about invasive species. They're concerned about the movement of plant materials that are not indigenous to an area. There's cases where unmanaged urban growth causes sedimentation, excess stormwater runoff, and those kind of things. That's why you're seeing some of the legislation you're seeing. Those requirements are requiring areas to be planted to capture some of that runoff, and we need to be at the table to plant those. So let's think about our watershed. Let's look at that. Every one of us lives in a watershed, in spite of the fact that you can still meet up with people and say, I do not live in a watershed. And where do they live? Apparently they have no concept of what a watershed is. It's immaterial whether you live in the Piedmont or live up on top side of a mountain. You live in a watershed. Where I come from, I live 150 foot from the Eastern Continental Divide on the eastern side. I could walk 150 foot and the water goes west into the Mississippi River. At my house, all the water flows down through South Carolina down into the Atlantic Ocean. So I live in a watershed that is considerably different than that most people in Henderson County live in. It's a smaller watershed as far as that county is concerned. But somewheres you live in that watershed. And how you manage the water in that watershed is going to impact not only yourself and your grandchildren and your great-grandchildren for generations to come, but it's impacting people downstream from you now. So you need to think about how you manage it. And as a landscaper, you can be at the table playing with those plants, putting them in the ground to protect that watershed. Here's what happens with a lot of our watersheds. Areas we have rapid urban development, and that includes almost all of North Carolina these days. You're converting woodland, or natural areas that are permeable, that allows the water to flow into the soil, percolate down to the water tables, and is a very good method of cleaning that water. But they're being converted into all of these hard surfaces, paved surfaces that are impermeable or impervious, and instead of the water being able to percolate, it runs off and ends up contaminating a stream or other body of water. It's a domino effect. As we get more and more volumes of water, more and more gallons of water moving across the surface of the earth, and that surface of the earth being compacted and paved over with whatever impervious surface, we're using, it ends up how all this water is forced into a stream that was designed to handle a certain amount of velocity, a certain amount of energy, and it causes a scour effect. It causes erosion. It causes this collapse of the stream bank. So we end up with the environmental policies. Most of us are resistant sometimes to legislative actions that impact our lives, and we sort of want to stand back off of those. And why is somebody making all these policies to control what we do? These policies are very important. Sometimes we don't all, and all being everybody in the community, want to follow what's really right for protecting our environment. So there's stormwater management regulations out there. There's vegetative riparian corridors. And I try to avoid using the term buffer. Many folks in western North Carolina tend to resist the term buffer and use the term riparian corridor. It's an area planted next to a stream that's designed to capture runoff from the adjacent properties, adjacent stream uses, and filter that water before it gets into the stream. There are also heat sink requirements. In urban areas where you have a lot of impervious areas, concrete, cement, masonry, glass, and steel, all those areas contribute to a lot of heat on those urban city areas. And so we need plants to capture some of that heat, plants to actually cool that environment. And if you just think about how much a paved area that's left open with no trees, how hot it gets in July versus the same parking lot planted with heat sinks, essentially planted with medians with trees and shrubs and grasses. And there's oftentimes as much as a 30-degree difference between a parking lot that's shaded and a parking lot that is not. That's a fairly good market. It's a fairly easy way to sell plants when we can think about these plants are not just aesthetically pretty, they're nice and all that, but they're doing something for our environment. They're cooling the area, they're saving us energy as far as how much energy we're spending on electricity or whatever other energy source to cool this area, to cool the buildings around it, keep your vehicle cool when you're parking there. And if you're walking in that parking lot and you're going from your car to the store, most of you would agree that you would rather walk in the shade than out in the full sun. There's something about walking in the cool of the shade on a hot summer day that appeals to people. There are a lot of local landscape ordinances that you need to either comply to or recognize may impact the plants and the plant choices you make in a particular landscape. So we can look at it as being threats to our individual being. All these regulations and these policies and these whatever you want to call them, they can be threats. They can force us to make decisions that we may not have ordinarily made, or we can look at them as opportunities for the green industry to step up the plate and actually use plants in a way that goes beyond our traditional mindset of what plants are used for. Historically, we thought of putting out landscape plants just because it beautifies our environment, but now we got to think about putting out landscape plants because it protects our environment. It cleans the air, it cools the water, or it cleans the water, or it helps cool their environment. There's a lot of areas there that we can stop and realize that we're providing something beyond just an aesthetically pleasing environment. There's a lot of common water quality problems out there that we can address as landscapers. Places where there's a lack of buffer, and I actually ventured out and used the term buffer in this slide. The lack of the buffer in this particular stream bank situation, it's an actual stream bank situation in Transylvania County, where they decided to avoid fencing the cattle out of the stream, put pasture all the way to the stream. And the idea was this is a great place for the cattle to run in and get their drink of water and cool off. Not. Yes, the cattle will do that, but they prefer to drink water out of clean tubs off-site. They would prefer to have clean water that's pumped to those watering troughs as opposed to getting it out of the stream. It's a hazard to the cattle. Actually, the losses of calves in a stream like this are greater than the losses of natural causes. The lack of a buffer there ends up causing a lack of shade, causes heat stress on the fish, ends up causing other factors. But with the buffer, we end up with the shade. We end up stabilizing this bank. We end up saving the soil and actually save part of the farm. So who really wants part of their farm down in the Gulf of Mexico? And that's where it ends up being if it washes down in the river, particularly on those streams west of the Continental Divide. It filters out runoff, including nutrients and trash, possibly pesticides and other pollutants, and it minimizes direct impact. So one of the laws, just sort of a brief of one of the laws, NPDES, National Pollution Discharge Elimination System, basically reauthorized from the Clean Water Act, which is a federal law, and created some permitting mechanisms as far as protecting those streams. One of those permitting mechanisms had to do with the stormwater program, and some of the recommendations for certain particular municipalities required various BMPs in dealing with stormwater discharges. Two of those BMPs include Phase 1, which are the major cities, Phase 2, which are smaller communities that fall within urbanized areas. And they may have a particular larger city with a lot of small satellite communities, satellite townships that are tied into that particular larger city. The regulations in these actually give some opportunities of best management practices for managing stormwater that you and I as landscapers can look at and actually generate revenue from. And most of you, I assume, if you're landscaping, the bottom line is generating revenue. You're really probably, it's a healthy thing, but that's not the entire reason you're in it. You want to pay your mortgage, you want to buy the kids' clothes and shoes, and you want to eat every night. So you've got to generate revenue. A great place to generate revenue is on some of these stormwater Phase 2 regulations. EPA, through the federal government, actually authorized delegation to the states. In our particular case, North Carolina Department of Natural Resources, the Department of Division of Water Quality, regulates some of these stormwater regulations, meaning that the municipalities must get permits and process those permits for the way they discharge stormwater. And there are some processes involved. Public education, sometimes public education through the municipality, public participation, illicit discharge elimination, construction runoff control, and some counties are actually hiring their own facilitators or authorizing bodies. They may hire somebody to go out and do the inspections and have their own policies that are, in most cases, more stringent than the state regulations. State regulations where at one point you had to have certain permits if you disturbed a site greater than 1 acre. Doesn't mean you shouldn't put in the protection in less than an acre, but the permitting process was greater than 1 acre. And now the counties have taken over, and most of those counties are more stringent than the 1 acre. Some of them are as tight as 1,000, 2,000, maybe 4,000 square feet. Extremely small areas where you're disturbing the site. You actually have to protect for the stream, any streams, and avoid any construction runoff. There's post-construction runoff. These are permanent structures to avoid sedimentation into the streams. And there's some basic policies for pollution prevention and good housekeeping that impacts all of us. This last one is probably more so for us as landscapers. Some of the other stuff is for a grading contractor leaving the site, temporary site, before the landscaper gets in the site. These policies are for development and implementation of strategies which include a combination of structural and or non-structural best management practices. Some of those practices include rain gardens and stormwater retention. The municipalities or other organizations must have an ordinance or other regulatory mechanism requiring implementation of these practices to control that runoff, and it's got to be within the boundaries of the law. We need to ensure adequate long-term operation and maintenance of these controls, so when you put those in, you may end up having to bid on maintaining those particular practices. In many cases, you as a landscaper may have the opportunity to determine the appropriate best management practice in the particular site with some measurable goals to help that particular municipality reach those control measures. Here's some of those BMPs again. Rain gardens, we'll look at briefly. Stormwater bioretention, and stream bank gardens, or if you want to call them buffers. Here's a treatment approach using a rain garden, fairly sophisticated rain garden, where they actually put in a bioretention cell in addition to the regular rain garden, and then they're monitoring sediment and pollutants in this particular cell. Some of those cells are just designed for a particular purpose, but this one was more for research. You have a grass filter strip next to the road, catches a lot of the sediment before it gets into the swell. Swell captures the rest of the water, moves it toward this rain garden, and you notice the picture is kind of dark, but there's a lot of planted area up in here of a lot of different kinds of shrubs and herbaceous plants that are filtering the water before it actually gets in that final bioretention cell that captures the balance of it and dumps it in the storm drain system. Here's a low impact design. Low impact development is going to be hot. If you as a landscaper are not looking at LEED certification, you're going to be missing the boat in 5 years. I would say that in 5 years, we will be seeing anywhere from 65–70% of our landscapers being required to be LEED certified or get out of the business. They will be mandated to have that certification or they will not be surviving their business. What is a heat sink? It's a green space designed to reduce solar heat in urban areas. If you think about how hot it gets in an urban area, in a parking lot, like I mentioned before, we've got to look at ways we can cool that environment and actually prevent some of the carbon pollution, carbon dioxide pollution from some of those environments. A lot of policies coming in place. There are few currently, but the concept is emerging rapidly in major urban areas to reduce energy cost. If you're close enough to Charlotte, you'll see that market is exploding when it comes to putting in heat sinks. Mecklenburg County and Charlotte are probably on the leading edge in North Carolina as far as protecting water quality and reducing heat sinks, reducing heat in the urban areas, and doing a lot of those other things that help positively impact the environment. It's great market potential. There's a lot of areas that are looking at native plants to put into those areas. They want to create a sense of place, and sometimes they don't know what that sense of place entails. And so we as the green industry have to be on the leading edge to help educate them what a sense of place is. We need to be looking at plants that create natural habitat for wildlife and then reduce the threat of invasiveness of the plants we're using. Some counties have ordinances, some municipalities, some even down to very local areas, such as maybe a gated community or a high-end community. They may have an ordinance that requires certain things to occur. They can be developed by the board of the municipality, or they can be as simple as being developed by the contractor or the developer who built the facility. They may require what they perceive as native plants. And notice I said what they perceive as native plants. So as a landscaper, you may have to educate them what a native plant is to that particular setting. I've seen a case where there was a landscape architect, very specifically, it's got to be native, but on his plant list, he included some things that were definitely not native. He had English boxwoods and he had shore juniper. And this was western North Carolina and a mountain community. Well, we didn't have too much seashore very close by. So I'm not sure what the shore juniper was growing next to the native rhododendrons. That somehow his understanding of native and mine seemed to fail to mesh. Industry can be and should be involved in this marketing niche by educating authorities in marketing sound plant choices. So we're helping them make decisions based on science, not on perceptions. I'm going to sort of wrap up with my top 12 choices of stream banks, plants for stream banks and rain gardens, and one caveat. I'm a plantsman, and if I gave you an entire list of everything that I think would be great in that area, we're going to be here for a while. So I sort of reined myself in and chose 12. And they're definitely not inclusive of everything. Some of them may not even be as adaptable here as they would be where I'm at. I think most of them will be, but you'll have to make your own call on that. Clethra alnifolia, or sweet pepperbush, very good native plant to western North Carolina, very tolerant in a lot of conditions, a variety of conditions. It comes in white or pink, varying sizes depending on the cultivar, from the small ones that only get maybe 2 to 3 feet tall up to the normal size of 12 to 14. Extremely fragrant, attracted to hummingbirds and to butterflies. Fairly long bloom period in the summer. But again, a great plant not only in stream bank but in wet areas and rain gardens where it actually will tolerate not only wet conditions but will tolerate the infrequent drying out. Hardiness to zone 4 and up to zone 7. It gets a little bit heat stressed in zone 8. Buttonbush or Cephalanthus occidentalis. One that's can be finicky in some places in the mountains, but occasionally found on our stream banks. Probably more adapted here in the western Piedmont than maybe on the higher slopes and elevations of some of the more mountain areas. Very much plant for stream banks, will work okay in bioretention areas. I would avoid them in true rain gardens. They will live through a drought, but they tend to have some heavy dieback in a severe drought. So they're kind of borderline for rain gardens unless you have supplemental irrigation on that rain garden. So if you end up with several months of drought where you don't have rainfall, this one's probably not going to perform as well as some of the others. Itea virginica, I have to admit, if I've got a favorite, this one is the favorite. Virginia Sweetspire, again, another plant that's very similar to the Clethra in that there are a lot of sizes, from dwarf forms that could almost become a ground cover to taller forms that become more of a semi-shade, semi-hedge-like size. Somewhat tolerant of light shearing, not particularly happy of heavy shearing. A lot of flowers, again a fairly long flowering period, attracted to both butterflies and some birds. nice white flowers, and so far I haven't seen one that's pink. Somebody sees one that's pink, let me know. I'd kind of like to have a sample of that one. The only caveat with this one, it prefers a fairly acidic soil. If you put it in an area that's very alkaline, you will have some chlorotic conditions. Ilex decidua, or possum haw, one of our native deciduous hollies. And there's 2 or 3 species of ilex that do very well. This one tends to be one of the more tolerant of a wide range of conditions. Verticillata is another one that almost is a rival, but sometimes has some issues in a few places. It's not particularly grown for an attractive foliage plant, although the foliage in the summer is relatively okay. But once those leaves turn yellow in the fall, and they turn yellow and turn loose fairly quickly, you end up with this nice, attractive red fruit that persists, usually on into, I've seen them as late as Christmas. Once birds start getting hungry and start foraging, they pretty well clean up the fruit off of this one. Red is the most common fruit color, but there is a yellow form, and there's one that's somewhat orange in color. Rosa Carolina, one of our native roses. It's a stringbank rose, a plant that I have yet to find reliably in the industry. I'm not sure why it propagates as easily as a tea rose. You can stick cuttings much like you would any hybrid tea rose. Granted, it doesn't have the multiple petals of a tea rose, but it does have the fragrance and it does have the tolerance of wet conditions and being very adaptable to string banks. That's where it's found. It is a single petal pink. I think there could be some hybridization and some selections made, but to my knowledge, nobody is really working with this plant. Sambucus americana, our native elderberry. Plant very adaptable to stream banks. We're using some in rain gardens, particularly rain gardens with some capacity, with some size. Very adaptable. Occasionally you'll find this particular elderberry on dry slopes as well as along streams and along ditch banks. So it has some ability to tolerate different conditions, extremes. Does produce a great dark fruit. Probably not quite as large a fruit as Sambucus niger or the European elderberry. Has the potential of being not only a plant for stream banks and rain gardens, but a multi-use plant. Some of our herb processors are growing these and using the extract in medications, mixing it with echinacea for cold medicines. It's fairly widely adapted for that particular use. So I see some potential at being not only a niche market in the landscape, but a potential plant for that growing herbal medicine market. Viburnum dentatum, or our native arrowwood. There's a lot of cultivars of that, some of them much more prolific in fruiting and flowering. Very attractive white flowers, probably less attractive than maybe some of the more exotic viburnums, but yet from a distance, from a landscaper's perspective and looking at it from a larger scale than just close up, it can be a very good showpiece. Flowers persist longer than most of the exotic viburnums. Has a very good clean foliage that seems to be consistently resistant to most pathogens that attack viburnums. Similar triloba, your pawpaw, another native plant to the coves of western North Carolina, a native all up and down the eastern seaboard, all the way up into Michigan. And if you think about one of the terms for this plant, one of the common names is Michigan banana. So it's a plant that's very hardy, very reliable throughout most of the east. A plant that's underused. Difficult to propagate to some extent, but very, very underused. Another plant that not only has potential in our landscapes as a small tree, but has potential in commercial production for its medicinal properties as well as the fruit that it produces. Most of the research on this one has been done on medicinal extracts for certain abdominal cancers. Fairly reliable. It just simply hasn't been pulled into the trade as quickly as they anticipated. One researcher said that, and this is his concept of its potential, that the market in the southeast could potentially increase to as much as 46,000 acres. He's seen the potential for this plant just for the cancer extracts of increasing to 46,000 acres in the southeast. The only disadvantage to the fruit is it's highly perishable. Once it ripens, it doesn't have a shelf life. And so working out the shelf life issue and storage issues, and some folks had worked on it and actually processed it and put it into frozen custard almost immediately off the tree. So you almost process it, put it into some kind of a packaging that's, value added as opposed to trying to sell it fresh off the shelf. Cornus amomum, our silky dogwood, probably the most common stream bank plant. Can almost become rangy, if you will. Gets overgrown in some places. Very easily propagated. We use this more frequently on stream banks as a live stake. Basically cutting cuttings in the dormant season and put a starter hole and placing those in with a rubber mallet. And it's basically an 18-inch stick that we plant them that way, and there's not a root on them. I do have been doing some research with one of the researchers at Mills River at our research station and one of my growers, and we're looking at the possibility of a modified live stake production system where we're sticking the cuttings into plug trays, rooting them, and then going back in and planting them all summer long and seeing how much results we can get with doing that. And so far the results have come back that we can actually plant them through a drought with no management at all, no follow-up irrigation, and get fairly good livability all summer long. We've done that 2 years in a row in 07 and 08 on sites that were extremely dry with the water table and the stream level so we're very low. Some of the sites very rocky, and we're still getting greater than 75% livability even through the drought of those 2 years. Lindera, benzoin, spice bush, one of the many plants that our grandfathers or grandmothers or further back than that in some cases used as an herbal plant. Got the name spice bush for obvious reasons. Very good cove plant, very attractive fall color, usually this deep yellow, and has some little red fruits, not particularly persistent, not near as heavily berried as maybe some of the ilex, but has some potential of being a great landscape plant in moderation in certain sites, and particularly on stream banks and in some rain gardens if you use it in moderation. You don't want a whole lot of them, probably one or two in a rain garden, a fairly large rain garden. Magnolia virginiana, Sweetbay Magnolia. This one's kind of an interesting plant, and then most areas in North Carolina it's evergreen, but several winters in my area and further in the western part of the state, it's a deciduous tree. So you end up having the potential of it living throughout the entire state, but most parts of the state being evergreen in those extreme western mountain areas, and cold winters like we just experienced this year, the plant's going to be deciduous. Coming back out with nice leathery green leaves, extremely fragrant flowers, smaller than the grandiflora, but extremely fragrant. Flowers, fragrances, almost that of, some people say it smells like lemon pledge. I'm not sure whether I quite agree with that, but it has sort of a lemony fragrance that doesn't have the chemical odor of lemon pledge. Another one of my favorites. Zephyrrhiza simplissima. And if you care to say that 11 times, you can for me, but extremely interesting plant. Yellowroot has that name for a reason. If you ever dug yellowroot, you'll see that the roots are very yellow, contain a lot of Barbarian. It's a native plant that's a relative of barberry. Native to stream banks, cove areas, very aggressive once it gets started. It spreads as a good ground cover and is semi-woody. It's going to stay somewhat evergreen all winter. You'll see some discoloration, but for the most part you've got this mass of foliage growing through most of the winters. Some of the winters it'll kind of desiccate more than others. But great stream bank plant. I have actually seen it attempted to be used as a ground cover at Daniel Stowe Botanical Garden. They were attempting it out in full sun and it just wasn't particularly happy. Needs light shade. It really prefers to have very moist conditions, but it would do okay in a rain garden where you had infrequent rains. Get a very dry season, you may want to give it some supplemental water. It does have medicinal properties. There are extracts from this plant. Our forefathers used the Barbarian from it, the roots, and extracted the sap from the roots and created teas, primarily used it for stomach ulcers and stomach ailments.